I am literally in the air right now, been never stored. First class, I am so new at it. Use a ride a metro, let us get this retro. Looking for reds on my feet, baby, let's go. Selection what they know me by, that's what they call me. Gotta catch a flight with the fans when it's stormy. Life full of dawn, change shit's gone. Always in the lab with the fresh kicks on. I'm at the MGM, rockin' MCM.
After procrastinating and reworking this video long enough that I've lost all passion for it, today I come and offer forth Warhammer 40k Space Marine. Aside from providing fodder for my obsession with Warhammer, Space Marine offers fun third-person action in a tight and reasonably polished package. The gameplay, whilst certainly not without its issues, is most certainly a good enough time, especially if you like similar games or mowing down hordes of enemies. Speaking of which, before I go into the game in detail, I should probably bring everyone up to speed with the basics of Warhammer 40k. The Warhammer games are a series of tabletop war games created by UK company Games Workshop. These IPs are licensed out for books and video games, the properties you're most likely to be familiar with. Space Marine takes place within the Warhammer 40k universe, the gothic sci-fi flavour of wargame provided by GW. The basic setup is as follows. In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there's only war. Mankind is a cocktail of xenophobia, fascism, and religious zealotry, all in service of the God Emperor of Mankind, a deified figure that unified humanity millennia ago into the Imperium of Man, and who now lies in a constant state of near death atop his golden throne. Humanity's at constant war with any heretics that defy the God Emperor's sanctity, primarily all aliens, or Xenos as they're called. These aliens include the elf-like Eldar, the insectoid Tyranids, and brutish orcs. Underlying this endless warring is the presence of chaos, a realm of psychic energy that influences the physical world. Also known by the Warp or the Immaterium, it's a dimension full of psychic energy inhabited by four gods that wish to exert their influence as far as possible. This should cover what you need to know for now, but there's unfathomable depths to dig into if you're a lore junkie like me. Now that we're around 2 minutes into the video, I can finally talk about the reason you're all here. Released in 2011 and developed by Relic Entertainment, Warhammer 40k Space Marine has you take control of Captain Titus, the captain within mankind's force of superhuman soldiers called the Adeptus Astartes, or more commonly, the Space Marines.
So that's it? What, we some kind of...
Warhammer 40k Space Marine.
Specifically, part of the group referred to as the Ultramarines. Titus and his subordinates, Sidonus and Leandros, will look familiar if you've seen anything 40k related, as the Ultramarines' battle armor are iconic to Warhammer. These three are part of a regiment deployed onto a planet-spanning Lockheed Martin factory called Graia to repel an invading force of orcs. After reenacting the world's first Halo jump, Titus lands on one of the invading orc ships, at which point you're given control of Titus and immediately thrown into the action. The gameplay of Space Marine is a mix of melee and ranged hack-and-slash combat, and makes up the vast majority of its around 8-hour playtime. This relatively shorter playtime definitely works in its favour though, as the trickle of new weapons and abilities keeps the gameplay fresh. Titus has both a melee and stun attack, which combo together in a few ways. The melee attack deals quick damage and chains together on repeated use, while the stun attack also deals damage but stuns enemies, capping off a combo. While stunned, enemies can be killed in a Doom-style glory kill that rewards health. This is the only way to heal in the game, and while this does make tearing through hordes of attacking orcs more engaging as you have to monitor your health and time takedowns effectively, there are issues that I'll touch on later. Mobility-wise, Titus can sprint and dodge roll, with rolling allowing a few valuable iframes for getting out of hordes of orcs or the radius of incoming grenades. Over the course of his journey, Titus expands his arsenal with leftover Walmart stock. Starting with a simple bolter pistol and working your way up to heavy weapons like the melter gun and las cannon, these weapons are all relatively unique and allow for differing playstyles. While the game certainly places emphasis on tearing through orcs like XPM ScoMo at a soccer match, making use of your ranged options to pick off certain adversaries is equally important. Enemies are often equipped with guns themselves and will very quickly reduce you to glorified mincemeat if you don't deal with them quickly. On controller at least, the game is very generous with aim assist, meaning there isn't too much stress on actually having to hit your enemies, but more so on adapting to the situation you're placed in. While Titus tears his way through the forces on the orc ship, their leader, war boss Grimskull, makes his first appearance. Grimskull, despite his limited appearance throughout the campaign, is one of its highlights, and he's emblematic of how wonderfully the game handles its depiction of Warhammer orcs. Though it definitely does miss out on some of the funniest parts of their lore, their mannerisms and voice work for all the orcs in the game is spot on. The over-the-top Cockney British accents they scream their battle cries with makes for a melodic cacophony that I'll miss in the sequel. After clearing the deck of the ship, Titus turns the craft's turrets on itself and brings the whole thing down. On the surface, he reunites with Sidonus and Leandros, and the three rendezvous with the infantry forces that have been camped there for some time already. The current officer in charge, 2nd Lieutenant Mira, informs Tetanus that the orcs have taken control of the orbital cannon that shot the Ultramarines' ship down, and are stopping reinforcements and supplies from entering orbit. In response to this, the Marines wake their way to the cannon, starting a short jetpack sequence in large outdoor hallways where you're empowered to wreak havoc through orcs that are placed with far more verticality than in other areas. The game uses this flight mechanic 3 times throughout its campaign, and only for short periods, after which the pack is shrugged off for one reason or another. After making their way to the cannon, the three sabotage one of the artillery shells with explosive charges and destroy the gun, clearing orbit for the incoming ships. They then continue onto the Titan Manufactorum to seize control of any Titans. Bipedal war machines big enough they probably cost almost a whole percentile of the US military budget. However, on their way to make use of Grai's extensive public transport system, they find the Orcs have put together a battering ram to enter the compound. Boarding the ramshackle vehicle, the Marines fight their way through the passengers on board and use their extremely poor driving skills to crash the ram. This is where I'll issue a spoiler warning, as it's the beginning of the second part of the game. What I've covered so far acts as an introduction to the game and its mechanics, and from here it provides more weapons and builds a story. On their way into the Manufactorum, the Marines are intercepted by a servo skull, which gives them a message left by Inquisitor Drogon. Inquisitors are the Imperium of Man's secret police, searching out and quashing any hint of heresy or corruption throughout the many worlds mankind inhabits. Imagine the Gestapo, KGB, and CIA had a kid who they donated to the Roman Catholic Church, and you have the Inquisition in a nutshell. Drogon was on Graia creating an experimental device, but has been trapped by the invading Orcs, and so Titus, Sidonis, and Leandros head into the facility to assist. On their way, calling in reinforcements to secure the Titan Invictus.
That's a surprise tool that can help us later.
The three meet up with a frustrated Drogon, who informs them that the experimental device he was working on, called the Psychic Scourge, has the power to end their Orc problem. Despite the danger involved, and lack of Imperial permission, Tambourine, Sidon, Leprosy, and Dillweed all head further into the area to get the power source for the device. Unfortunately, whilst getting this power source, they're attacked by Grimskull and his crew, causing Titus to have to retrieve the power source manually, exposing himself to raw chaos energy. Following this, Drogon expresses surprise and suspicion that Titus managed to survive his contact with the completely inconspicuous glowing object.
Check this shit.
Titus claims to have no idea how he's unharmed, and so the four continue their trek back to the Capitol building. It's a January 6th joke. Doesn't even work. It's around this time that you'll have had an opportunity to acquire most of the available arsenal, providing me with a convenient segue. Titus can hold 4 range weapons and 1 melee weapon in theory, but in reality, only 2 of the range weapons are customizable. Melee-wise, you start with a blade that's attached to your armor, but quickly upgrade to one of Warhammer's most iconic weapons, a chainsword, which has arguably the most satisfying takedown animations of the 3 weapons on offer. After this upgrade, you'll have options at different times to swap to the Power Axe or Thunderhammer. The difference between the Power Axe and Chainsword is essentially negligible, but the Thunderhammer does considerably more damage than the 2 smaller weapons, and eliminates the button mashing required for takedowns on larger foes. However, it does also remove the ability to use the 2 swappable weapons Titan has equipped. Unfortunately, despite the choice offered here, you'll still be using similarly uninteresting combos to cut down the violent militants standing in your way. In regards to ranged weapons, you'll hold a pistol, bolter, and 2 other weapons at all times. The pistol and bolter are fixed and can't be swapped out. In the other slots are the options of the Stalker Bolter, Melter Gun, Storm Bolter, Vengeance Launcher, and Las Cannon. They all serve different purposes like sniping, shotgunning, or grenading, and you'll be able to swap them at various points in the game. Unfortunately, however, once you find the combination that works for you, there's very little incentive to change. As I mentioned earlier, there are also other issues with the combat. During takedowns, you're still very much vulnerable to damage, meaning that in a lot of moments, trying to clutch your way out of a bad situation accidentally results in Titus being more exposed than a Minecraft YouTuber on Twitter. While Titus does have a regenerating shield that would theoretically help to protect you in these moments, in practice it's quickly torn away as soon as 3 or more enemies decide you look like easy pickings. Another issue that rears its head soon into the game is how unbalanced groups of ranged enemies can feel. Maybe I'm just suffering a skill issue, but while it can be positive by providing some strategy to fights, ranged enemies in numbers often seem to melt you before you have a chance to pick them off. In the last third of the game especially, there are some enemies that tank hits and still deal lots of ranged damage. Overall, while it definitely has its rough spots, it pretty well achieves what it sets out to do. Carving through hordes of orcs is extremely satisfying and remains fun for the length of the game, and the positives vastly outweigh the negatives. I will, however, definitely be hoping they improve upon certain aspects like the takedowns in the sequel, especially given the near-perfect examples given by the new Doom games. Continuing with the story, after going through another short jetpack section, the Titus fan club are airlifted out to a nearby facility, where they intend to activate their
inexplicable giant floating baby head attractinator!
After a short air battle and crash, they arrive and begin their ascent. In this tower are these stupid turret enemies that I hate with every fibre of my being. They're not like the worst enemies by far, but I do not know how I would deal with them without one-shotting them with the las cannon. Reaching the top and activating the weapon, the orcs on the planet are not killed. Instead, a portal opens, and it's revealed that Inquisitor Dumbass has been a puppet for a Chaos Lord called Nehemoth the whole time. Nehemoth serves the Chaos God Khorne, a god that revels in violence and anger. If you've ever heard the phrase blood for the blood god, skulls for the skull throne, Khorne was the origin of that. Nehemoth attempts to take the power source from Titus, saying he'll ascend to being a Daemon Prince, but is attacked by Grimskull, allowing the Marines time to escape. It's at this point the game switches its colour palette drastically, moving from mostly warmer tones to cold purples and blues, and providing me with a good transition into the art direction for the game. For a 2011 game, the character models hold up surprisingly well, especially if compared to some other games from the time. The art direction is consistent, and I would say it does the 40k aesthetic pretty well. It certainly achieves the monolithic feeling of a Forge world, with endless corridors and warehouses of concrete and metal. It certainly doesn't tap into the dark, oppressive nature of which much of the Warhammer world presides, although possibly that's just a result of the game being so much set in outside or large spaces. In regards to the Marines themselves, I think the modelers and animators did an amazing job. They move with a proper feeling of weight. They can't turn on a dime like heavy characters in many other games, and every movement has a great deal of momentum. You really feel like Titus is wearing 300 kilograms of armor through the way he moves. I hope they don't change any of this in the sequel, as the way it's done here still looks really good 12 years later. The Marines leave the tower and meet up with Mira, with whom they plot to destroy the gate using the Titan Invictus that was captured earlier. From this point on in the game, not only are you pitted against orcs, but now servants of Khorne in the form of demons, Chaos Infantry, and Chaos Marines. While this certainly switches things up visually, gameplay-wise this changes very little. These new troops behave exactly the same as orcs, except they have double the health. This is also where the difficulty ramps up considerably, even playing on normal. While nothing is too frustrating, some sections certainly felt like they were very drawn out. Mostly long sections without checkpoints. Using Titus's glowing keychain with the Titan, the tower is blown up and the portal destroyed. Titus gives the power source to Sidonus, and they go to meet Mira at the facility's landing pad. Unfortunately, on the way, they have to split up, and Titus and Leandros reach the pad just in time to watch Sidonus get ganked by Nehemoth, who takes the power source, says some ominous stuff to Titus, and promptly scoots out of there. Seeking vengeance, Titus begins a journey to the Spire to face Nehemoth down. Assisted by another regiment of Space Marines while crossing a bridge, he's then taken via air to the Spire. After one last jetpack section, which proves to be the best power trip of the whole campaign, Titus goes one-on-one with Nehemoth. Well, sort of. In actual fact, it's an extremely disappointing boss fight, where Nehemoth sends waves of the same enemies you've been fighting for the last 3 hours, followed by a bombastic set piece where Titus repeatedly grapples Nehemoth and pummels him to a pulp while falling off the spire. God of War would go on to steal this 7 years later, but make the crucial distinction of not making it your only interaction with the big bad. After killing Nehemoth, Titus and Mira revel in their victory, until another Inquisitor lands and arrests Titus for suspicions of heresy. Leandros had reported him after voicing his suspicions throughout the game about Titus' ability to resist chaos. And on this cliffhanger, the story finishes. All in all, a relatively simple story that suits the relatively simple gameplay. That covers most of the game. It's a pretty good game, and while I definitely don't think it's worth a whopping 75 Aussie dollars at full price, if it goes on sale, I reckon it's worth picking up. Needless to say, I'm also extremely excited for Space Marine 2, which should hopefully get more news soon. I'll definitely miss the orcs, but I'll be interested to see how Titus' story continues and how the Tyranids prove themselves as a new threat. I hope you enjoyed this video. The script had to be rewritten like 4 times because I'm very stupid, and I'm definitely still not very happy with it, but I'd love any feedback you have on the video, especially because this was my first narratively focused video. Okay, leave a like or something. Bye!
Check it out. Granddad! Flintstones?